Welcome everyone to the Effective Point of Accountability, your Effective Managers webinar for Wednesday, November 12th. The topic today is the effective point of accountability, and really a key point and something that would be helpful for all of us to, as a starting point, is what is the effective point of accountability? And the corollary to that is, of course, why does it matter? Today what I'll do is start with the second part of that question, why does it matter? And then we'll work backwards in terms of what is the effective point of accountability. I'll give you some examples, and then we'll summarize it at the end. In terms of who I am and where I'm coming from, Effective Managers is a specialized firm. It's been in operation only a couple of years, but it's grown out of another consulting practice which focused on organization design. And my experience as an individual, as a manager, as a CEO, and as a person that's been in management jobs for a long time. The whole focus of the company is really this around increasing productivity and profitability and making sure that that managers are as effective as possible, because those things are absolutely directly related. The most important relationship that employees have is their manager, and we really can't understate that. You'll see as I go forward with this. The other point I'd like to make is that we are a research-based organization, and we take a grounded approach. So we always start where the client is. We want to understand what your situation is and what concerns you have, and then based on scientific principles, help you in the most straightforward and effective way possible to improve the performance of your organization. So the first point is this slide here, the service profit chain. I always like to start with this one because it's groundbreaking research. It was first published in 1994 by James Heskett in Harvard Business Review. He's a professor at Harvard University. And it's in every manager's toolkit. I think anyone that's managed for any length of time understands this relationship between employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, and revenue and profit. So the issue then is if employees are more satisfied, then customers are more satisfied. That results in a lifetime value-added customer, and at the end of the day, a more revenue and profit for the organization. What's not as well understood, and which is very clear in Heskett's article, is that leadership and management practices underpin this entire service profit chain. So it starts with the way in which we as managers do our work in organizations, because it is the impact of the managers on employees that determines the level of satisfaction that they have in the organization. And if we look at our own research, what we see is that managers spend only 55% of their time doing value-added work. So if you think about that, it's like the head of the organization saying to all managers, you can start your workday halfway through Wednesday morning. It's just mind-boggling that managers are not able to focus in on those things that they themselves perceive as adding the most value to their work. So what we have found in the research that we did with the University of Ottawa is that accountability is very highly correlated with effectiveness. As you see in this slide here, it's a 0.74 correlation. So organizations that have a higher degree of accountability have higher effectiveness of managers, and we've seen from the Heskett research that will drive the service profit chain, so that organizations' performance will improve if managers are more accountable and more clear, particularly about the accountability that they have in their organizations. So wrapping up the introductory section, I did want to make the point about what the definition of accountability is, because it drives everything else. Accountability is an obligation for which one can be held to account for one's results and one's actions by a specified other. So there are three elements here that are really important, and I'd like us to focus in on that for just a few seconds. So it's an obligation for which one can be held to account. So that feeling of obligation is very important. it's being held to account for one's result and one's action. So it's not just accomplishing the results, it's accomplishing the results in a particular way. So it's the results and the actions of the individual. And then thirdly, this concept of a specified other is really important. So if I'm being held accountable for something, I'm being held accountable for something by another individual, and that's critically important. This is often confused with a concept where people hold themselves accountable for things, and the word I use for that is responsibility. And we really do need to differentiate between that self-held belief, that desire to do something which I feel responsible for, versus that thing in the organization which has been delegated to me by a specified other, my boss, my manager, and that manager can call me to account for the results that I've achieved and the way in which I've gone about achieving those results. So that brings us then to the heart of today's webinar, which is looking in at the single point of at the effective point of accountability. And I want to start with two concepts that are fundamental to this, so two underlying concepts. The first one is a concept of a single point of accountability. So some position that has the authority to delegate something throughout the organization delegates that to one individual and holds that one single individual accountable for the results. In my experience as a manager and in my observations as a management consultant, this is critically important in organizations. You cannot hold a group accountable for something. You can't hold a committee accountable for something. You have to hold an individual accountable for something. If you think about the sign in most corporate lunchrooms which says that everybody should wash their own dishes, and you look at how many dirty dishes are in the sink, you can see how well this concept of group accountability works. It simply doesn't. If everyone is accountable for something, then no one is accountable for that thing. The other part of single point of accountability is when I've been delegated something, I can delegate parts of that to other individuals, or I may even delegate the entire accountability further down the organization. But that does not relieve me of my accountability to my manager for that work. So even though I delegate it on, I'm using my judgment to figure out how best to do that work. But it's not an answer at the end of the day to say that something didn't happen because I delegated it on. Once something is delegated to an individual, that accountability sticks with that individual, and then they decide how best to get the work done. The other second related concept is the lowest point of accountability, and this has been used more and more in organizations, and I think is entirely appropriate. And the thinking here is that the individual who's closest to the action should have the accountability and the authority to do the work. And there are a lot of reasons for this. That individual is closest to the customer or to the client. They have the information that they need to make the best decisions because they're so close to, quotation marks, where the action is. And the response time is fastest here because they are able to gather that information, gather all of the supporting data that they might need, and make the decision and then move on with it. So it results in a more nimble organization, which is important. There's an important postscript here, though, and the postscript is that we need to bear in mind the required capability of the accountable individual. So we can push accountability as low down the organization as possible, but only as low as possible. In other words, we have to take into account the complexity of the work and make sure that that is aligned with the capability of the individual to do that work. So, for example, if I'm the CEO and I'm moving, I'm going to open operations on another continent and want to build a plant on another continent, I might delegate to my vice president of operations the accountability for building that plant over the next 2 or 3 years and to be fully operational in that time. It would be ludicrous for the VP of operations to delegate that down to a frontline manager and say, okay, you're going to be accountable for delegating this. So I pick a silly example, but to pick the extreme to make the example is you have to find the capability of the individual in the organization that is able to make that, to do that work and has the capability to do that work. So the VP might break that up and have some person do some research, some person do some best practices, some person actually travel there and see what the situation is like and so on, bring that back together and do the work. But the lowest point of accountability needs to be matched to the individual with the capability to do that work. Okay, I think I've labored that one to death. So I'm sorry, skipped ahead one there, too many. So if then we're thinking about the effective point of accountability, that's the single point of accountability in the organization that is as low as possible in the organization, taking into account the complexity of the work and the capability of the individual to do that work. So that is by definition then the effective point of accountability. So what I'd like to do now in the next few minutes is walk through some examples just to help with clarification with that. And as I walk through this, think about how intuitive this is. In other words, it kind of makes sense intuitively, and yet organizations are so poor at doing this. So it's always worth some thought to think about why in your organization are things not as clear as they should be in terms of clarity of delegation of accountability. So I've got a sample organization on the slide in front of you, starting with the director level. We have a frontline manager and a worker. So the frontline manager is the boss of the worker. The director is the boss of the frontline manager. So the director in doing his or her work needs to think about within the plan that he or she has for the department, what is the value added work that I need to do? So this is work that has been delegated to me by my vice president that I alone have the capability to do. So I need to figure out what that work is, and in consultation with the vice president, do that work. Now, of that work, some of it I may be, of the work that's been delegated to me, some of it I may be able to delegate on down to my frontline manager. So there you see the delegation arrow. That delegation arrow then leads to the frontline manager, who must do some value-added work. So there's work that they as individuals need to do, and there's work that they can delegate to the frontline workers. And then frontline workers, they run out of people to delegate to, so they're doing the value-added work, which is their proceduralized work, which they do day in and day out. So the delegation of work then becomes fairly straightforward if you think about it in those terms. So the example that I would like to talk to you about then is the effective point of accountability for sales. So let's start with the board level. So the board has an accountability because it's accountable for the overall policy, direction, and strategy of the organization, would set targets for profit, for top-line revenue, and so on through the strategic implementation process. Once the board has done its work, it would be delegating an accountability to the CEO. So for the sake of this example, let's think that the accountability is to achieve the bottom line. So coming out of the strategy, you have top line revenue, you have expenses, you have profit expectations. So the CEO would be held to account by the board for achieving that bottom line within the time frame of the strategic plan. So that would be the effective point of accountability for that objective, achieving the bottom line, and it would be delegated to the CEO. Now, the CEO cannot delegate that lower because there's no one lower in the organization that could be called to account for achieving the bottom line, because each of them are accountable for only some piece or part of that. So in support services, they might be accountable for developing efficiencies. In operations, they're accountable for developing and delivering the product in a certain way. And here in the example, the vice president of sales would be delegated work by the CEO, which would be the overall sales targets, which would be necessary to achieve the top line revenue necessary for the CEO to achieve their accountability for the bottom line. So the effective point of accountability for the overall sales target would rest with the vice president of sales. The VP of sales then has a very important role in helping the CEO to meet his or her overall accountability. but has as their effective point of accountability this overall sales targets. If we think about it moving down to the next level, the VP of sales, again, can't delegate overall sales targets to any of the directors of sales, but can certainly delegate regional sales targets to each of the directors of sales for each region. Here then, in combination, the VP of sales is thinking about how sales will come together across all of the regions, so for the whole company, how best to allocate accountability for meeting certain sales targets, understanding how those will all come together, and then delegating it. So the effective point of accountability for a regional sales target for region X would rest with the director of sales of that region. So the whole point behind delegating work then and having that effective point of accountability is thinking how low can we delegate work in the organization in a way that that capability, the capability of the individual is aligned with the complexity of the work that is necessary. So that's it for how work flows down the organization. If we think about how work flows across the organization, there is also an ability to select and identify the effective point of accountability, but it's not as intuitive in the way work flows down the organization. So I've put together an organization chart here. It starts with one individual at the top. That could be a senior vice president in charge of a department. It could be a VP in charge of a facility, or it could be the CEO. So anyway, it's a representation of an organization. Most organizations, by the way, in my experience, don't look as neat as this one. But anyway, for example purposes, this will work. So if we think about how work flows across the organization, let's think about processes. So the first example is, let's think about, I call it the very imaginative name of process A. So process A goes across department green here. So we have 3 individuals that are involved in this particular process. So the 3 of them need to collaborate to be able to get work done. It could be preparing it could be preparing financial statements. It could be an assembly line in a factory. It could be any number of things, but each of them depends on the other. So something, one employee does something, the other employee takes that, does something else, and then the third employee finishes the work. So that's process A. Now, one of those 3 people could be delegated accountability for overseeing the process, for troubleshooting the process, for training on the process because they're more expert, and so on. But the effective point of accountability, the individual who can approve the overall process, who can decide issues resolution, who can change the process, who has the authority to change or to improve the process, is the manager of those 3 individuals. So the EPA for the process A is the manager of the 3 individuals who are involved in process A. A common mistake in organizations is that one of those 3 individuals that are involved in the process itself would be named the process manager and would be seen by the organization as accountable for that process. And that becomes a mistake because that individual does not have the authority to decide unilaterally changes, does not have the authority to decide differences of opinion, and doesn't have the authority to direct others in terms of the way in which they will do their work. Only the common manager of those 3 individuals does that. Now, that's not to say that the common manager has to do all of the work. No, not by any stretch of the imagination. They can rely on one of those individuals to take the lead in the process. But at the end of the day, if there's a problem that needs to be resolved, that manager is the only one that can decide and direct. So let's take a more complicated process now. Let's look at process, also imaginatively named process B, that goes across two sister departments. So workers in Department Green do some work collaboratively, and then the output of their work goes to Department Gold, and then they continue working on this. So this could be could be processing sales invoices. So someone in operations prepares the order, puts the order together, ships the order, and then sends over to accounting the notification that the order has been shipped. Then someone in accounting receives that, generates the invoice, sends the invoice out to the client, notifies sales, and so on. So it's a process that goes across 2 departments. So the question then, where is the effective point of accountability for that process? You have to find the manager who can decide and direct. So if there's a dispute between the 2 departments, the director or the common manager in Department Green and the common manager in Department Gold can certainly meet and try to work out the differences and resolve how they'll work together. But if they can't agree, then only that common manager of the 2 departments would be able to make that decision. So if at the top of the organization we have the CEO and the dark green position is the vice president, then in this case only the vice president can decide these things. So again, they don't need to do all of the work in terms of managing, coordinating, training, raising issues and so on that come out of a process, but they do need to be identified as the point of accountability for deciding and directing. So let's make it slightly more complicated, and we'll take process C, which goes across the entire organization. And I won't belabor the point, but you can see that if there's a difference between any 2 departments in terms of how this process can be implemented, changed, improved, or if there's problems, how to fix those problems, there's lots of points of discussion where you can try to resolve the issues, work it through, come to common agreement. But at the end of the day, in this situation, it's only the CEO or the head of the department that is able to decide and direct. And that individual needs to not only be accountable, the effective point of accountability for that process, but also needs to understand that they have this role, delegate appropriately, and make sure that there are processes in place for dispute resolution. So I have a question then for you. If we look at Department Gold and Department Blue here and say they're the only 2 individuals that are involved in this process, say it's an expense account. So a director in Department D puts together the expense account, sends it over to the blue department who approves the expense account, checks it, and issues the check. So only 2 individuals involved. If there's a dispute between them with regard to the expense account payment system, who's the accountable manager? So the effective point of accountability is still with the CEO in this situation. So certainly the director for the gold department and the director for the blue department could come together and try to resolve it and figure out if there's a dispute at the worker level. If they can't resolve it, the 2 VPs can try to resolve it. But if not, the CEO in this situation is the only one that can really approve and set the context for the overall expense account policy process for the entire organization, because it impacts on individuals that go across those lines, and the CEO in this situation is the only one that can decide and direct. Now you may be asking the question, well, that's crazy. Is every expense account dispute going to come up to the CEO? And I would agree with you, no, they should not. Part of the job of the CEO is to decide what the policy is. First of all, if a policy is needed. Second, what the main aspects of the policy will be. The CEO isn't even necessarily developing the policy. Probably the CFO, directed down to a director somewhere, is putting together what the policy should be, and there should be lots of discussion going on with all of the involved parties as this is being put together. But because it does involve all departments, finance cannot unilaterally put in place an expense account policy that's going to impact on everyone. I remember working in an organization once where that did happen, and it was very, very disruptive to my ability to do work, because the expense account policy, in fact, put all of the work back on my department instead of the work staying in finance where it had been for years and years and years. So it could be the right decision to be made, but it's important that there be that collaborative aspect in terms of deciding how work best can be done. And in this kind of a situation, only the CEO has the perspective of the entire organization to understand how work can best be done throughout the organization. So understanding that accountability becomes very important. So the example I have here is the budget process on the next slide. So the CEO is accountable for the bottom line. The CEO could delegate to the CFO an accountability for the budget process. The CFO would have to involve everyone else in the organization in developing that budget, in coordinating the development of the budget, in consolidating the budget, in making recommendations for the approval of the budget, and so on. So the CFO has a key role in doing this work, but the CEO is the effective point of accountability because all departments are involved and the CEO needs to approve the budget process, even though the vice president or CFO would be accountable for managing it. The CFO then might delegate down to the director of finance the gathering and the consolidation of the budget information, and that director would work with all of the other directors across the organization. So the effective point of accountability for gathering and consolidating budget data, still sits with the CEO because all of the different departments are involved in that, and that becomes part of the budget process. Now, in most organizations, that should work smoothly, and it'll never have to be escalated to the CEO. But if something does come up and it's substantive and there's a major difference of agreement between departments, then there's something wrong with the way that policy was put together, and it does need the attention of the senior management team to work that through, and ultimately the CEO to make the decision. The last example I have on this slide is to show where the manager of finance position might be delegated accountability for data entry and analysis. So the manager of finance is doing that entirely within the Department of Finance, has all of the data and information necessary within his or her own department, so that the manager of finance then becomes the effective point of accountability for the data entry and analysis because it does not go across the boundaries of the other departments. So the takeaway on cross-functional work is that the effective point of accountability rests with the position that can decide and direct. And I like those two terms. So which is the position that has the accountability and the authority to decide changes, improvements, whether we need a process or not, and has the accountability and authority to direct others in terms of how they will do their work within that policy or a cross-functional process. So a good question then is how do CEOs know how to have the most significant impact on manager effectiveness? So I did just want to bring your attention to the Effective Managers Survey. It's a new product that we have out and is available for CEOs, heads of HR, or the heads of significantly sized departments within organizations to measure the effectiveness of their managers, what percentage of their time are they actually spending on value-added work, and what are the roadblocks or things that are getting in the way of them being as effective as possible. So it does assess the effectiveness, the accountability, and 6 related measures. So that brings me to the end of my 30 minutes. I will take questions now and just check to see if anyone's typed in any questions.
Hi, I'm Dwight Mahalitz, President of Effective Managers. Thank you so much for downloading the webinar. I hope that you enjoyed it and will find it useful. Feel free to check out other parts of the website for interesting downloads. Most are free, some are at a nominal charge, but I'm sure you'll find lots of interesting tools there and things that can help you be more effective. And in fact, that's what my job is. My job is to help you, help your organization be higher performing. The bottom line is that I want to start where you are, understand your problem, and provide services that can help you solve that problem and implement a solution as quickly and as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Give me a call, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you, talk about your situation, and see if there's anything that we can do together. Thank you.